I'll introduce you. Vicki has 30 years of experience working for the environment, farming, food and justice. She's the strategic lead on agriculture at Wildlife Trusts. She was the head of sustainable farming for Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. And she previously worked at Friends of the Earth and War on Want. She's been an expert consultant for many non-profit organisations and has been on advisory groups for the government. Vicki is the author of Rebugging the Planet and Perfectly Safe to Eat, the facts on food, and continues to share her knowledge through writing and social media. So Vicki, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to give this talk. We'll, Guy, if you and I turn our cameras off, and Vicki,
I'll take the floor.
please begin.
Thank you. Yeah, so I do have many years working on environment and farming and food policy, as Simon mentioned, and that drew from my interest in nature and particularly in invertebrates. And I've always had a passion for invertebrates, and that might crop up during my talk, just to warn you. But I've worked on environmental justice issues and food and farming very closely. But what this talk is going to be about is the potential for citizens to make a change, both at at their own personal level, but also wider than that. And I'll talk a little bit about farm policy, just because it's in flux. There's a lot going on in farm policy here and globally. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstandings about what we could do with farming to feed us, but also nurture and restore nature and tackle climate change. A lot of misunderstandings and misinformation going around globally, particularly on the issue of food security, which I just mention here because it's very live, because Rishi Sunak spoke at the National Farmers Union conference in the UK on Tuesday, and food security sort of raises its head. We've got to grow more food to feed the world is one cry from UK farming sector and other countries as well, which lends itself towards sort of continuing business as usual, creating incredibly intensive farming systems, uniform monocultures and farming systems, which are hugely damaging, but also ignore the fact that actually we produce enough food to feed 11 billion people. It's what we do with that food. It's what we do with our economies and abilities of people to actually buy food. It's about debt that we have, and trade and aid deals. So many issues. It's not often to do with raising productivity. It's to do with what we actually use the crops for and the land for. But we can talk about that if you've got any crops about that. I actually got a presentation as well, which is I think it's nice to have pictures. There are a few slides with too many words on. I just looked at it again, but bear with me and I'll go through those ones quickly, hopefully. So can you all see that? If somebody could shout, just so I'm sure, because I can't see any of you now.
No, it's not up yet.
Okay. Okay, I will. Oh, why isn't that showing? It's classic, isn't it? You think you're showing something and then it doesn't work. Share screen. Put that up.
Yeah, that's coming.
Need to see it now. Okay, great. We'll go to the first slide. There we go. And put it on presentation mode. Can't let me. It's not letting me see.
It's on that note.
Yeah, it's just annoying. There we go. Hopefully, can you see that now?
Perfect.
Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, I'm Vicki Hurd. The FRES stands for Fellow of Royal Entomological Society, the insects that I love so much. But I work for the Wildlife Trust. I've actually not been there very long, so apologies if I'm not 100% sure of all the figures and facts and stuff, but that relate to the Wildlife Trust. But it's a fascinating organisation because it has a certain amount of democracy about it, because it's a federation. It's not run from the centre, like the RSPB or National Trust in the UK, which are large organisations with land and a lot of control and quite a lot of influence. Wildlife Trust does as well, but it's a different sort of organisation. It's got this is on the left is shows the 37 wildlife trusts. I think that's quite out of date, actually. I'm sure it's 46 now. Anyway, oh, maybe it's 37 in England, 5 in Wales, and you've got others in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and some Alderney and Isle of Man islands, and they make up a very large federation. And a grassroots movement. So in that sense, it's very fitting for this audience to talk about grassroots and citizens action. And it's about nature. There's 900,000 members, 39,000 volunteers working at a local level, both on a large number, thousands of sites, some tiny and some large sites, some farms, to protect those sites for nature and for nature and for people, and for nature and people and food. And they do a lot of work campaigning. That's what I do campaigning and lobbying. So I'm not actually on the ground, looking after the hares or the insects directly, but I'm doing national work in terms of media work, writing reports, research reports, lobbying MPs and ministers. And I've been doing that for 30 years. So that's my bread and butter. But we do a lot of work to help people actually take action themselves. So this middle picture here that you can see with the bee is our latest action, which is about asking people to sign a petition, which we are going to hand in to a company called British Sugar, which is actually owned by AFB, the oh, I've forgotten the acronym now. It's a huge, huge British food corporation. And they are the sole purchaser of sugar beet, which is what we grow in this country to create sugar, of which makes up far too much of our diets. But it's a monopoly, and it's been lobbying the government to use a particular pesticide, an insecticide called a neonicotinoid, which you might have heard of. It's incredibly toxic to bees. 1.5 teaspoons could kill 4 lorry loads of bees. It's incredibly toxic, neurotoxin. And they want that to be used because you can create more sugar more cheaply. You get higher yields if you're using this because you're destroying any of the animals that might want to compete with you for that plant as it's growing. I won't talk about it too much, but I just mention that because we're asking people to sign the petition, and 25,000 have already. When we did a petition 2 years ago on the government to stop them allowing farmers and British Sugar to use this, I think we got 400,000 people signing. It was, people are really care. They really care. And what we need people to do is both care, sign petitions, send off letters to MPs, go and visit their MPs, but also share those actions. So more and more people. So that multiplier effect is critical. Anyway, one of the things, that's what I do. And I spend a lot of time in Westminster trying to persuade MPs to do the right thing. And it's because our world is in a state of emergency. We've had huge crises over the last four years since COVID, but crises were going on long before that because we weren't tackling climate change fast enough, and we weren't tackling the huge loss of nature. And Britain is sadly one of the nature deprived countries in Europe because of the way in which we've managed our farming and other aspects, but a lot to do with our farming and other issues as well, like game and other activities in the rural areas, but also our urban areas. But we absolutely know that we need to restore nature and wildlife for all sorts of reasons, for our health and our well-being, but also to ensure that we can actually have clean water, healthy air, food, and wildlife. And all those things are threatened by the kind of impacts that we're making in our lives, and from climate change in particular, because the changing climate is creating incredibly unstable conditions for our wildlife, and a lot of our wildlife cannot cope. And that's going to impact on our food supply. It already is in many parts of the world. It's already killing millions in parts of the world, but here it's starting to really impact. But we say it's not too late to turn this around. I mean, those pictures there, the light pollution there is one issue which I know a bit about because it's moths and other night flying invertebrates are really affected and often killed off by too much light pollution. It might not be light pollution, that might be a fire, actually. I'm just looking at it anyway. Either they're bad for the invertebrates. And obviously moths, we're now finding are one of our most important pollinators. We often think of bees and wasps and hoverflies as key pollinators for our plants, particularly our food plants, but actually moths are as important. They just do it at nighttime, so we don't see. So I wrote a book called Rebugging the Planet. So I've got it here. You can buy it in all good bookshops. I probably get it on a discount now from the publishers called Chelsea Green. But I wanted to explore why the invertebrates were having such a hard time, and they're such an important part of the ecological system, both as part of the food chain. You know, for no vertebrates, no birds, no bats, no food. You know, it's all that. But also, I love them, and they're a very important part of our systems. So I wrote that book to explore that, but more importantly, to tell people what they can do. So it's full of tips and ideas and thoughts and amazing things that they do for us are explored in the book. But just very quickly, I don't want to be too depressing, but climate change, huge impact. They're very tiny animals with a large surface area to volume ratio. And so they're particularly affected by extremes of temperature and moisture. At the same time, they do have ability to move often if they've got wings, and they do have ability to evolve much more quickly than we can. So, and they can move, but you know, they are massively threatened by climate change, particularly the specialists, the ones that are more generalist. They can have a more general. They don't mind where they live, and they don't mind what they eat. They're more likely to survive the cockroaches, the flies, things that we tend to dismiss, but they're incredibly important too. They're also threatened by loss of habitat, loss of refuges where they can um, hide from predators, and where they can safely have nests and mate and rear their young or lay eggs, and find refuges where they need to lay their eggs in particular plants, things like that. And the corridors, the green corridors, which you might have heard of, are really important for animals to travel through to get to a new place. When they have a egg hatching, those eggs all need to move away from the the host, the mother plant. Like, you know, we all know we'd all be crowded together in houses if we stayed in the same place. They've got to be able to move through the environment, and we've lost those corridors. Things like road verges are incredibly important corridors. Rows of trees, hedgerows, in urban and in uh, rural environments, and in back gardens, incredibly important refuges. So all these habitats we've lost a lot, particularly in the farmed habitat, because we've got ever bigger fields to fit the ever bigger um, needs of the food industry for cheap raw materials, but also to fit bigger mechanization of farming. And that's what that is actually turning around. We've lost a huge amount of hedgerows in the last century, and we're now, I'll talk about how why that they're coming back, which is really good news. Farmers are putting them back. They're being helped to put them back, and they want to, because it really helps farmers as well. But anyway, loss of habitat is still a major issue. Why we've got a big problem in nature in this country. There's also invasive species can undermine the ability of our native species to survive and thrive, and diseases can come in and hurt our wildlife, not just invertebrates. And then there's pollution. There's chemical pollution, pesticides, nitrate fertilizers, organic fertilizers, runoff, you know, manure from factory farms. Plastic pollution, microplastics. I talk about that in my book. It's really growing awareness now of just how harmful that is. We have plastic pollution in our bodies, is microplastic in breast milk. And you can imagine how these tiny plastic bits can be mistaken by insects, and particularly animals in the aquatic environment, for food. And they eat them, and then it bungs up their stomachs. You can imagine the harm that's doing. And in the marine environment, hugely problematic in coral reefs. And because they're also very large surface area to volume ratio, they can transport diseases and toxins as well. And then there's noise and light and phone pollution. Even our mobile phones can cook a bee, because they have such high energy in high frequency transmission of our things. It's bad for bees. I talk about that in the book a bit, but you know, there's an awful lot of ways that we are really harming our wildlife through harming our invertebrates. So we need to change how we treat the natural environment. This is one particularly timely example, because we also have a campaign about this. This is peat, and we've used peat for not for a very long time. We've used peat for heating for thousands of years. Probably people have dug up peat to use in for fires, but over the last couple of centuries, we increasingly used it for our a growing medium for our own personal use in gardens, to produce plug plants and flowers, but also we're using it to produce our horticulture crops. And what we've successfully done is get the government to agree to a ban on sale of peat. Unfortunately, it's not actually happening yet because there isn't enough parliamentary time to get it done. But the reason peat is so important is our wetlands, where the peat comes from or has been de-wetted in order to release the peat, are incredibly rich in terms of biodiversity and wildlife. Some of the most unique creatures and plants and ecosystems. Also incredibly important for carbon storage of carbon. There's a huge, when you um, de-wet an area that's wet, that was previously wet, and there's large parts of the UK, unique peatland habitats, lowland peatland habitats, as well as upland peatlands. They release a huge amount of carbon and methane, and the actual product itself locks in the carbon because it's packed down of sphagnum moss and other plants, packed down really deep layers of carbon that are stored there forever unless we take them out and dry them out and use them to make plants and plug plants. So we're asking people to take action on that. And it's just an example of why we need to change our relationship with the natural environment. And the other point is we don't need that peat compost. There are solutions, other solutions. And we say investing in nature, we can address a lot of the multiple challenges that face us. So these habitats have incredible ability to absorb carbon, which is something we really need to do to address climate change. Forests, woodland pastures, all these things can be places where you can grow products that we need, but you can also sequester carbon and create habitats for nature, refuges for wildlife and biodiversity, and create those ecosystems that we need for our well-being. And they protect also homes and people. If you have a completely uh, deforested upland area and you've degraded the soils, it's very, very unable to hold water. So when you've got a big rainfall pattern, the water isn't held in the soil because there's no trees and no good soil to hold it in. It runs down and floods downstream in cities and villages, etc. So that's a nature-based solution in several forms that can come from different way of looking after the land. And then people on the even in an urban environment, I think a lot of councils are doing things like rain gardens, where they're planting trees in areas which will absorb the rain which falls on an urban concrete environment, because we're going to increasingly find our cities flooded if we don't do something about that. It's also about reconnecting people with nature in their daily lives is really important. And we've got a really good new studies showing just how much we could save on the NHS if we have more people access to green spaces. I don't have the figures on the top of my head, but they're all on our website. If you look at our health work on the Wildlife Trust website. So we got a vision of about 30% of UK lands and seas to be protected and connected for nature's recovery by 2030. I'm not so keen on targets, but this is a target we have. I think all of it needs to be connected for nature, and it can be. And everybody has a role to play, creating those habitats, bringing wildlife into everybody's lives, which will benefit everyone, tackle climate change, and help restore nature. And as in the UK, and this is true in many parts of the world, farming makes up a huge part of land use. So it's key in its recovery. And just very briefly, in terms of policies that we need that I'm campaigning for at the national level, I'll go through these quite quickly, then we could talk about them later if you want. We need new policies and support, finance, to reward farmers for the public goods that they can do through farming differently, through agroecological farming, which means farming with nature, not getting nature out so it doesn't eat any of your crop, but actually farming with it, using the plants and the microbes under the soil and the invertebrates under the soil and the insects and creatures above the soil to actually tackle diseases, tackle pests and diseases, do the pollination, create a really nutrient-rich environment for the plants to grow so they're healthy and can withstand diseases. Some people are calling it regenerative farming or regen. I'm just about to release a new briefing on that. And there's lots of things, even the most intensive farmer, apart from the factory farms, I have to say, intensive house animal factory farms, livestock farms, but most farmers can transition to regenerative farming in whatever stage they're at, and it needs to be on the whole farm, not just the hedges and edges in the field. But for that to work, we also need the market to play fair. So we need supply chain regulations, and we need to invest in diverse, that's a bit of a typo there, in diverse retail. So farmers have more routes to market, so they can sell more direct to you through better food traders. That requires investment in the infrastructure and training and skills, but it's about the supply chain beyond the farm gate as well. I've done a lot of work in that area. We need better regulations that are enforced to protect our rivers, our soils, our nature, our biodiverse sites, and to tackle climate change. And because there are so many competing demands, I mean, land is under huge pressure. People want land to be plantations, they want it to be housing, they want it to be farming, they want it to be for nature, they want it to be for recreation, motorbike racing, whatever. There's so many demands. That we've got to have a land use framework that isn't subject to the vagaries of whoever can shout loudest or whoever can pay the most. That land use framework should be based on a democratic process with local wide involvement to develop what that land could and should be used for and how to get there. And what you'll be hearing later about the commons, I'm sure we'll come into that, because we've still got common land, and that should be really protected. And we should have more common land protected for the wider society to be able to use it, access nature, wildlife, get green experience. Anyway, there's loads of things need to happen land, and we've been promised this for many years, and we still don't have it. We really need it, and we really need it more than ever as climate change kicks in, because we'll be losing land both here and globally. We need to tackle horticulture. We've got a tiny amount of fruit and veg that we eat compared to what we need to eat. 5 a day is actually a very low bar, and we're not anywhere near that. I think we're about 2.3 fruit and veg a day. We need to eat at least 10 a day to have a healthy diet and for our children to be healthy. But we actually don't grow much of the fruit and veg that we eat. 50% of the vegetables are imported, 83% of the fruit. We need to invest in horticulture here, but agroecological horticulture that isn't poisoning the land, and more diverse. We need honest labeling so people can, actually make good decisions about the dietary, the health, and the environmental and the welfare impacts of what they're eating. And we need to get rid of junk food. Junk food has grown and grown such that 54% of what we eat in the UK is junk. It's high sugar, salt, fat, bad for you. Loads of ingredients you wouldn't find in your cupboard. Definitions vary, but we all know what we're talking about, and it makes up far too much of our diets, and particularly our children's diets, such that the biggest cost to our National Health Service is diet-related disease, obesity, and also tooth decay. It's incredible. Tooth decay in children is staggering. Anyway, so we've got to talk about that, because also junk food means very cheap raw materials from the farming industry, from farmers, and so they have to produce ever more intensely to provide those cheap raw materials for the junk food, for the highly processed food, and they get ever fewer rewards. We're getting junk food. It's not serving anybody except the companies in the middle. And obviously climate change, overarching everything, mitigation, reducing our climate change emissions from the land, and adapting our food and farming and land systems to be able to cope as temperatures and precipitation rise. I think this is the last lots of wordy slides, but you can be part of the solution. So I'm going to go through 4 things: how you can do what you can do near you for wildlife, act as a nature-friendly consumer to support nature, tackle climate change, and help our rivers. What you buy, it's not just what food you buy; it's your clothes, and I'll talk about that. And then critically, the third point, just as important, what you can do in terms of as a citizen, bugging your MP, your local authority, your party candidates in the UK, as we have an election drawing up. Party candidates are beginning to need to be lobbied to say what they believe needs to happen for nature. And you can join people. And then the final one, if you can support organizations, if you can support your local wildlife trust, there's a wildlife trust in your area. You can support them either with your time or money, or spreading the word about what they're doing. All sorts of ways you can help. So just quickly on managing your garden and land. This isn't just about your garden. You might not have a garden, you might just have a window ledge, but everybody can do something to support nature. Whatever you do to make something green, to make sure flowers are coming, preferably native flowers, you'll be helping the insects and also by default the wider wildlife to feed, mate, rest and have a refuge. And you'll also find people will be asking questions, so you can talk to them about why this is important. In my book I've got loads of tips and loads of boxes how I can do. And importantly, you can join with local communities to help, and your local wildlife trust will help with this, and they'll be doing loads of stuff at the local level to actually get local parks and local green spaces. Even your road verge could be a space for nature, a vital space, a vital corridor for nature. And also helps our air pollution and our water, as I was saying earlier. And what you can do with your workspace, if there's any space around where you work or your school or your university or wherever you work, could be good for nature as well. Get people to do things in their lunch breaks can be really good for them. Or in your workplace, if you work with your suppliers, to create space for more wildlife, improve sustainability credentials of what you make or what you do, if you're in the business of making things. But there's so much you can do that will make a big difference, and the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that urban and areas are really important. It's never more so. I've seen so much evidence that urban spaces are incredibly important to provide that refuge and that space for nature as much as in the urban environment. But you can get involved in rural areas as well. Ideally, people will be able to go more to rural areas for walking and for visiting wildlife parks and spaces that are protected for nature. And the Wildlife Trust do a huge amount of information at a local, in your trust and at a national level on our website. I've just sort of put here a few of the resources that I found just doing a quick scout. Loads of things for kids, and they run children's days in the Wildlife Trust near you. And there's, as you can see on those little icons, there's loads of stuff, and it's all presented in a really easy to use way for different audiences. So please do have a look at that. And a lot of it's free, a lot of it. If you can get involved with 30 Days Wild or get involved with your local trust, you can do so much just by being there and by diversifying the kind of people that are at those trusts. Because one of the things that has been quite rightly leveled at the environment and conservation movement here is that it's too white and middle class, and this belongs to everybody. It should be involving everybody, and everybody cares. It's just we need to make that happen by talking to everybody, saying this is for everybody, get involved. This is your nature, this is your wildlife, please support it. But also being embracing of all ages, communities, cultures, getting involved. And that is really changing, but it needs to change more. So the second point, be a nature-loving consumer. You can do so much to reduce your impact by changing what and how you buy, because almost everything you buy comes from the land in one shape or form, or it's been produced using water from the land, from the water environment, either marine or fresh water. And I've already talked about avoiding peat because of its incredibly important carbon, nature and water contact. That's just one example. Changing your diet, that's absolutely critical. And if everybody changed their diet to eat less junk and more fresh, you'd be putting much less pressure on the farmed environment to not produce those cheap raw materials in incredibly uniform, large monocultures in a farmed land. But it's also, if you eat less and better meat and dairy products, supporting those farmers. If you do eat meat and dairy, you might choose not to, in which case you're really having a less impact on the land, because farming for livestock inevitably is inefficient. You're putting crops, unless it's even grass fed, you're often fertilizing the grass. So it's a lot of inputs, a lot of land used in producing livestock. But when they're fed crops like soya and grain, it's very inefficient use of that land. So eating less and better is a much better approach to meat. And there's fish that you should be avoiding to protect the marine environment over here and overseas, and wasting less. There's a huge amount of waste of food at the domestic end, but there's a huge amount of waste of food along the whole supply chain. And there's loads of policies that are needed by government here and globally to reduce the waste that happens in the supply chain. But if you can do your part by not over purchasing and eating all the food you get. And if you have got waste, always compost it. But the other thing that I talk about in the book, and that is really important because it has such an important impact on land, and people don't necessarily always think about that, is the clothes you buy, the tables you buy, the furniture, the materials, the curtains, all that is extracting from the land, from nature. Every cotton crop or tree plantation has an impact. And it's really quite staggering how much the cotton industry is doing harm. It's incredibly bad in terms of water stress. Whole rivers are dying out in Eastern Europe because of the cotton crops, and in Africa. And it's incredibly damaging. It's also hugely toxic because the amount of chemicals used to curb particularly it's particularly attractive to pests, as you can imagine. There's a particular one called cotton bollworm, and that volume of cotton has just exploded over the last 30 years, and people are buying far too much clothes. We don't need so many clothes. We can repurpose, reuse, we can sell. There's loads of wonderful apps now where you can sell really easily clothes that you don't need anymore. And it's lovely to see how many young people are using that now. That's really gives me heart. But the less we put demands on land for stuff, and that includes tech. You know, every mobile phone, every computer and laptop requires an awful lot of minerals and fossil fuels to make. So repurposing and reusing, making sure you get all your tech recycled is absolutely critical, because some of these minerals cause a huge amount of harm and toxic rivers and harm to people who extract them or are in the area. And the most important thing you do is spread the word about this. The more people who get this and see that it's not a middle class occupation, or it's not a fussy thing, it's not a other thing other people do, it's something all of us can do. The less, the more you can spread the word, and particularly to the younger generation, but to everybody, about reuse, recycle, repurpose, the better. And sustainable diets. Make it the norm for people to think about their diet in terms of what impact it has on the land. And there's loads of resources out there to do that well. I probably should um,
Yes,
get
Vicky,
going quickly.
yeah, time's ticking, Vicky. So,
How much have I got left?
well, you've gone over the allotted time, but
Right. Oh no. Okay. This is just about changing attitudes. People will be frightened. These animals, they're both really important. And so the third one, gosh, I'm sorry about this. Bug your MP. Governments are absolutely critical to make those changes I described earlier to policies. And you can talk to your MP about why you want to do that. There's loads of resources on the website. And your parliamentary candidates, as we're in an election year in the UK, join with others to make a bigger influence, write letters, do the postcards, and talk to companies that you buy things from, that why you're not buying or why you're buying a particular way. So support those campaigns, do what you can. And we have campaigns on our website you can go to. And the fourth one doesn't need much explanation. If you can help with donating your time or your money and working with your local community, you can do a huge amount to raise awareness and support nature's recovery. I've got some examples here of the things we want to do: getting every school having access to nature. We're getting places rewilded with wildlife rich habitats and things like that, so you can get involved in that. And getting things where you're supporting well-being for people to access nature, reduce pressure on the NHS, and support recovery and for people into the job market by getting involved in projects like this, Project My Place in Manchester. Really important, really good stuff, and they really work. We know that they work, so you can support those. And there, I've finished. Thank you. Please look at our website and get my book if you want, or follow me on Twitter, and I have a website as well, which you can see things for free. Thank you very much. Sorry to overrun.
oh, Vicky, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And you did a very good job of speeding up at the end there.
Yes.
And we'll share, if it's okay, we'll share your slides online alongside the talk. So all those resources will be available, along with links to you, your book, and to Wildlife Trust. So Vicky, thank you so much.